The snow was not a soft, cinematic veil. It fell with the grim efficiency of corporate paperwork. Heavy, wet, and relentlessly sticking. These oppressive flakes clung to the fine cashmere coats and iced the eyelashes of anyone foolish enough to linger outside the monolithic black wrought iron gates of the Whitmore estate. The landscape dissolved into a miserable, blurring gray, a fitting backdrop for the cold transaction about to take place. Inside, the air hung thick with the kind of pervasive warmth that only insulating wealth can generate. It was the silence of perfectly calibrated climate control, the plush resignation of hand-knotted Persian rugs, and the intimidating presence of a marble fireplace that looked permanently polished, having never been required to fulfill the vulgar task of working hard. Evelyn Whitmore stood precisely in the center of the library, her hands folded rigidly in front of her waist, a pose of calculated neutrality, as if awaiting a final grade on a decade-long performance review. 10 years of rigorous self-censorship had trained her body into that posture. Careful not to spill wine on donors, careful not to ask for too much, careful not to let the fatigue show in her voice, careful not to embarrass him in front of influential partners, careful above all not to make his mother, Margaret, feel even momentarily displaced. Across the vast expanse of the room, Grant Whitmore remained seated, his face illuminated by the ruthless blue glow of his phone. His eyes flickered rapidly, absorbing the high-speed data stream. Greedy scrolls through market charts, urgent messages, a calendar invite for something supremely important, something pointedly separate from her existence. "Evelyn," he stated. His voice modulated to a tone that sounded vaguely considerate, which somehow managed to sharpen the impending cruelty. "Please don't make this a scene." The words struck her chest with the physical impact of being blindsided, as if he had deliberately set a piece of ice there, waiting to see if she still possessed enough warmth to melt it. Evelyn blinked once, slow and deliberate. Her lashes were already wet, not yet from actual tears, but from the searing internal heat that was building rapidly behind her eyes. "Grant," she finally managed to say. She hadn't intended for her voice to sound so thin and small, but it did anyway. "You can't just order me to leave. This is my home." A small, impeccably precise sound drifted from the shadowed corner of the library. A porcelain teacup placed down onto its saucer with the finality of a gavel. His mother, Margaret Whitmore, sat perfectly poised in an upholstered wingback chair that seemed to mold itself to her shape, confirming she had always been the central fixture here. A formidable pearl necklace rested high at her throat, serving less as jewelry and more as an elegant warning. Margaret's smile was infinitesimally small. It never required volume to convey absolute authority. "It was your home," Margaret articulated with the cool precision of a scalpel. "In the way that a hotel lobby is a home, you were always fundamentally just passing through." Evelyn simply stared at her. 10 years of dedicated effort, nursing Margaret through various surgeries, through persistent infections, through the delicate, whispered humiliations of inevitable aging. 10 years of painstakingly holding the older woman's dignity together with clean towels, whispered reassurances, and endless vigilance. All of it collapsed, instantly atomized by that single, dismissive sentence. "A lobby?" Evelyn repeated, her voice hoarse, needing the auditory proof that she had heard the magnitude of the insult correctly. Grant finally lifted his head. He had that classic Grant face. Handsome, pleasant, highly successful. The kind of face that automatically earns unearned trust in high-stakes boardrooms. He fastidiously adjusted the cuff of his custom-tailored shirt, the heavy, expensive watch on his wrist catching the ambient light and flashing briefly. "You knew what this was," he stated without emotion. "This was always business. You signed the agreement." Evelyn felt her throat constrict painfully. She vividly recalled the day the prenuptial agreement slid across the sticky counter at their courthouse wedding in Manhattan. She had been 22, wearing a simple white dress she'd sewn entirely herself. He had dismissed it as standard protocol, a document to protect the family structure, insisting it was essentially meaningless because they were true partners. She had desperately believed him, wanting to be the kind of capable woman who didn't flinch or cower in the presence of serious money. "I signed it because I trusted you," she managed, her voice holding steady for 2 fragile seconds before it finally cracked. "You promised me it wouldn't ever matter." Grant offered a slight, almost apologetic shrug, entirely devoid of genuine remorse. "It's not personal, Evelyn. It's about stability. The board demands stability." He pronounced the word board with the profound, unquestioning reverence usually reserved for the word God. Margaret leaned forward slightly in her chair, the movement so subtle yet precise, like the silent insertion of a surgical knife. "And honestly, Evelyn," she continued, her voice dripping with disappointed assessment, "you've been looking rather tired lately. You've softened. You simply don't match the Whitmore brand aesthetic anymore." Evelyn felt the cruel sentence settle upon her like a cold, heavy hand completely devoid of any human warmth. Grant's phone emitted a discreet buzz. He glanced down and produced a small, genuine smile at something only he could see, a smile that definitively did not belong to her. He then smoothly slid a handwritten check across the vast, antique mahogany desk. It glided effortlessly across the polished wood surface, stopping dramatically at the far edge, where it teetered precariously as if intending to fall off on its own to avoid being associated with her. 50,000, he stated. "A fresh start. Consider it severance." Severance, a term used for corporate layoffs, for necessary amputations of undesirable parts. Evelyn stared at the inadequate, mocking number, an amount New York rent could effortlessly swallow in a few short months. "I cooked your meals," she heard herself say, the words sounding dry and formal, like a witness reading a list of disregarded exhibits into the record. "I ran the entire household. I managed the complex social calendar and the staff when you were frantically building Whitmore Capital from the ground up. I sat composedly beside you at every strategic dinner party and smiled reassuringly when you habitually lied about being a self-made man." Grant's expression remained stubbornly unchanged. "And you were fully compensated for your efforts," he countered smoothly. "You lived extremely well." Margaret's eyes gleamed with triumphant malice. "She thinks common kindness is a form of currency," she murmured softly to her son, savoring the moment. How truly quaint. The uniformed guard near the door shifted his weight minutely. Evelyn noticed him instantly, having learned in this world that power never resided in the loudest voice, but always in the person holding the physical keys. "You have 10 minutes, Margaret announced, her voice clipped. "Take your absolute personal items. Leave the jewelry. Leave the car keys. And do not, under any circumstances, take anything that belongs to this house." The cruelty was not loud or hysterical. It was cold and clinically efficient. Evelyn's fingers trembled once, involuntarily, and she immediately closed them into a rigid fist to stop the tremor. She looked directly at Grant, searching his eyes, waiting for a single, fleeting flicker. Anything that might prove the last decade of their shared life had actually been real. He offered none. His gaze smoothly slid past her, the way a busy executive looks past a low-level employee he has no intention of ever rehiring. The snow outside pressed against the library windows like a silent, growing crowd. Evelyn reached for the check. Her hand hovered over the paper for half a second. Then, with a controlled, alien calmness she barely recognized in herself, she sharply swatted it off the desk. The check fluttered down gracefully, landing near the polished toes of his bespoke shoes. "I don't want your money," she articulated, her voice dropping into a register that commanded attention without needing volume. "And I certainly do not want your pity." Grant let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. "Spare me the drama," he sneered. "Just go." Evelyn turned without gathering a single thing. She walked past shelves lined with leather-bound books Grant had certainly never opened, past formal family portraits where Margaret's tight, knowing smile was already cemented, unchanging across decades, past the vast marble foyer where Evelyn herself had once tirelessly arranged the weekly floral displays exactly as Margaret required. White, restrained, nothing that looked too vividly or disruptively alive. At the coat closet, she deliberately ignored the expensive, heavy-wool coat Grant had bought her the previous Christmas. Instead, she retrieved her old, slightly faded denim jacket. The one she had been wearing the first time she ever met him. The one with the distinctly frayed cuff she had always consciously refused to repair. A silent promise to herself that she would never become the kind of person who forgot what fray meant. When she stepped outside, the fierce, wet cold slammed into her face like a physical slap. Snow instantly filmed her lashes. The long, flawless driveway stretched ahead, empty and perfect like an endless runway. Behind her, the massive wrought iron gates began their slow, automatic arc toward closure. She heard the low motor hum, then the loud, definitive click, the solid locking mechanism engaging. It sounded utterly, irrevocably final. She did not scream. She did not pound on the iron bars. She did not beg. She simply began to walk. Her city boots were flimsy against the snow. Her hands quickly went numb. The thin denim jacket offered no heat, only symbolic protection. The estate sat isolated on the distant hill behind her, a cold monument built to people who had never once needed to ask permission to stay warm. A mile further, the pain in her stiff fingers had intensified to a dull ache. She carefully pulled out her phone with the reverent caution of someone holding the only match in a high wind. The number she required had resided in the deep, unvisited recesses of her memory for 2 decades. A latent, painful knowledge, like an old bruise. She had sworn she would never need to use it. She dialed anyway. The line rang once, twice. A perfectly modulated, crisp voice answered. "Sterling and Rowe. How may I direct your call?" Evelyn closed her eyes, gazing back at the mansion that was already dissolving into the heavy snowfall. "Put me through to Caleb Sterling," she commanded. "I'm sorry," the voice replied automatically. "Mr. Sterling does not take unsolicited. Tell him," Evelyn interrupted, her voice rock steady, without the slightest hint of a shake, "that his daughter is ready to come in from the cold." There was a profound silence on the line, followed by the distinct sound of someone swallowing hard. "Yes, ma'am," the voice responded quietly. Evelyn slowly breathed out. The snow kept falling relentlessly outside, but somewhere deep within the heart of the city, a door had just been decisively opened. For the following 3 weeks, Grant Whitmore operated with the boundless confidence of a man who believed he had successfully outrun every possible consequence. His divorce attorney, Randall Clean, a sleek, exorbitantly expensive predator with a razor-sharp smile that never quite reached his cold eyes, assured him the prenup was utterly airtight. "Your agreement is clean, Grant," Randall stated in Grant's glass-walled office overlooking Midtown. "She has 0 assets, no counsel, and no viable standing. She'll either fail to show up, or she'll arrive with a public defender who can't read the contract fast enough. Default judgment is highly likely." Grant merely nodded, processing the forecast like listening to a benign weather report. That upcoming Friday was everything. Immediately after the divorce was finalized, Whitmore Capital would close its monumental merger with Sandstone Dynamics, a Phoenix-based tech conglomerate. A deal that would instantly elevate Grant from merely wealthy to completely untouchable. At night, he dined only in establishments where patrons knew better than to ask for prices. Beside him sat Harper Lane, 24, all bright, manufactured smiles, a PR associate he liked to describe simply as pure energy. "You're tense," she purred one night at a hyper-exclusive rooftop restaurant in Tribeca. "But it's an exciting kind of tense." "It's the deal," Grant admitted, swirling his neat whiskey. "Once this is done, it's a clean slate." Harper's ambitious eyes glinted. "And the wife?" He casually dismissed the previous decade. "She was a season, Harper," Grant said, referencing fashion trends, "not a life." He failed to notice how speaking the words aloud made the sentiment sound exponentially uglier. His mother certainly didn't notice. Margaret called daily, not to offer sympathy, but to congratulate him on successfully reclaiming the pristine family name. "To think," Margaret drawled over the phone, "we actually allowed a mere diner girl to wear the name Whitmore for 10 years. Grant permitted himself a satisfied smile at the phrase diner girl. It made him feel significantly taller. Meanwhile, Evelyn was neither in a temporary shelter nor reliant on a sympathetic friend's couch. She was residing in a substantial Brooklyn Heights brownstone, in a guest room permeated by the comforting aroma of old, well-loved books, high-quality lemon polish, and quiet, unshakable authority. Caleb Sterling did not indulge in ostentatious displays of wealth. He didn't need to. He was the kind of industrialist who favored simple cashmere sweaters and owned entire city blocks that people walked past daily without ever realizing they belonged to one man. When Evelyn finally entered his high-ceilinged study, he did not stand dramatically or rush her. He simply looked at her, the way a father looks at a cherished daughter after a long separation, waiting patiently to be needed. Evelyn's face was still pale and raw from the exposure to the fierce cold. The faded denim jacket still clung defiantly to her shoulders, an uncomfortable badge of recent trauma. Caleb looked at the jacket first, then his gaze settled gravely on her cracked, red hands. He didn't demand explanations. He simply said, quietly, "Sit." Evelyn sat. A man in a soft woolen cardigan stepped forward from the shadow of the room, looking for all the world like a kind, distinguished history professor. "Evelyn," he said gently, his voice soft. "I'm Martin Hale, Caleb's counsel." Not flashy, never featured on billboards, Martin Hale was renowned in the intensely private rooms where the fate of those billboards, and the corporations they advertised, was ultimately decided. Martin smoothly slid a thick folder across the mahogany desk. "An expedited hearing has been arranged," Martin said. "Friday. Same judge." Evelyn opened the folder and saw her entire existence brutally reduced to dismissive corporate boilerplate, irreconcilable differences, failure to contribute. She let out a single, dry, humorless laugh. "I kept his startup company financially alive," she reminded them bitterly. "I managed the sensitive accounts. I personally introduced him to the critical investor who saved him from bankruptcy in 2019. "We know," Martin responded softly, empathetically. Caleb remained absolutely silent, and that silence was a tangible weight, grounding the room, making it feel intrinsically safer than any space Evelyn had occupied in the last decade. Martin leaned closer across the desk, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "They are entirely counting on you remaining invisible, unrepresented, and compliant." Evelyn lifted her eyes, now clear and fiercely focused. "They were very clear, Martin. I stated I don't want his money," she said with precision. "I want justice." Caleb's intense gaze sharpened just slightly. Martin's mouth tilted upward, not quite a smile, but a deep, knowing recognition. "I've been looking very carefully," Martin confirmed. "Grant Whitmore has been consistently careless. He's been leveraging key assets he doesn't fully, legally own." Martin turned the page in the folder, tapping a specific paragraph with a manicured finger. "He's using the core proprietary code, the patents, even the foundational trust-backed seed capital as collateral." Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Trust-backed?" Martin paused, looking briefly to Caleb, who offered a brief, confirming nod. Martin continued, speaking carefully. "Do you recall the company that provided the initial, critical funding for Whitmore Capital back when Grant was nothing more than high ambition clinging to crippling debt?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "Arbor Creek Holdings. Grant always called it venture capital, a lucky break." Martin nodded slowly. "Arbor Creek is not a typical VC firm. It's a shell corporation, wholly owned by a complex generational trust that was established 22 years ago." Evelyn's breathing became shallow. Martin turned the folder toward her. The typewritten words were undeniable. "The sole beneficiary of that trust is you, Evelyn Sterling." The quiet room held its breath. Evelyn stared at the text until the letters ceased to be mere words and materialized into a powerful, undeniable weapon. I don't understand." Her voice broke. Caleb finally spoke, his voice deep and measured, careful not to compete with the churning emotion in the room. "When you left home at 19, he explained, you refused my financial assistance. You insisted you wanted a life built entirely with your own hands." Evelyn looked down at her hands, red, raw, and cracked. She had certainly built something. Caleb continued softly, "I respected your pride. But I could not, in good conscience, watch you potentially starve for the sake of a man's ego. Martin added the final, damning detail. So your father created that trust, funding it discreetly through Arbor Creek. That trust, Evelyn, is what originally seeded Grant's company. Evelyn's eyes widened completely. You mean? She whispered. Martin simply nodded. Grant Whitmore's celebrated self-made empire was built entirely with your inherited money. Your signature isn't on it publicly, but it is undeniably there. Evelyn leaned back, feeling as if the chair had been forcefully pulled from beneath her, yet it had remained perfectly still. Something old inside her, something she had quieted for years, decisively shifted into place. It was not rage. It was absolute clarity. Does he know? She asked. No, Martin confirmed. And neither does his expensive lawyer. Evelyn's voice softened, evolving into something far colder than fury. So he threw me out of a house while living inside a company that ultimately belongs to me. Caleb's gaze deepened, watching her transformation. Martin closed the file folder with a gentle thud. On Friday, he stated, we won't argue about marriage. We will argue about ownership. Evelyn looked up, her eyes utterly steady. They humiliated me, she said simply. Caleb's silence was profound acceptance. Martin's voice was utterly calm. Then we will respond with maximum composure. We will let the room do the screaming. Evelyn didn't smile. She merely nodded once. Outside the brownstone, Brooklyn traffic hissed on the wet streets. Inside, the temperature remained constant, but the power dynamic had changed forever. Friday morning arrived with the inevitability of a final verdict. The courthouse in Lower Manhattan was not glamorous. Its power lay precisely in its plain, brutal functionalism. Grant marched in with a swagger that he believed was his birthright, dressed in sharp charcoal gray, every stitch tailored to perfection. His mother glided possessively beside him, cloaked in expensive fur. Harper sat 2 rows back, wearing a strategically modest navy dress, efficiently playing the role of the devoted mirror. Grant checked his heavy gold watch impatiently. She won't dare show, Margaret murmured with self-satisfied finality. Randall clean leaned close to Grant. If she does appear, say nothing. Let me handle it. At 9 a.m. Sharp, the heavy oak doors swung open. The sudden hush did not descend instantly. It rolled forward through the room like a tangible, powerful wave. Evelyn walked in. She was wearing absolutely none of the clothes they had anticipated. No thrift store coat. No visible shame. No sign of trembling vulnerability. She wore a tailored suit of crisp white fabric, clean and meticulously cut. Expensive in a way that asserted its value without needing to ask for validation. Her dark hair was sleek, her posture quiet, yet profoundly self-assured. But the true, horrifying shift was the man walking precisely half a step behind her. He violently grabbed Grant's arm, his grip hard enough to cause pain. No, Randall whispered urgently, his voice thin with panic. No, Grant. Grant frowned, confused. What? Who is that? Randall looked momentarily nauseous, as if he might throw up his morning coffee. That's Martin Hale. He simply doesn't handle divorce court. Ever. He represents global institutions. He represents people who fundamentally do not lose. Evelyn sat down at the table reserved for the defendant without once looking toward Grant. She placed a high-quality fountain pen onto the polished wooden table with a quiet, precise click. All rise. The judge entered, wearing the bored, world-weary expression of a man who had already heard everyone's worst, most predictable excuses. Dalton, he began, reading the docket, then immediately correcting himself. Whitmore versus Whitmore. Let's make this exceedingly quick. Randall stood, slick and ready. Your Honor, my client seeks dissolution based on a prenuptial agreement signed 10 years ago. The defendant explicitly waived all claims to marital property or future support. Martin Hale rose slowly. He did not smooth his jacket or engage in any theatrical performance. Your Honor, he said, his voice soft, yet somehow perfectly audible throughout the large room. We are not contesting the prenuptial agreement. Randall smiled, a flash of obvious relief. Martin continued smoothly and relentlessly. We are, in fact, enforcing it. The judge's sharp eyebrow lifted slightly, a rare sign of interest. Martin's hand rested lightly on the folder, the movement suggesting he was about to open a critical door rather than merely commence a court battle. The prenuptial agreement contains a very specific clause regarding assets acquired independently of the marital union, Martin explained. Specifically, those assets remain the indisputable property of the acquiring party. Grant instinctively leaned toward Randall, a triumphant whisper escaping his lips. Told you. Randall's face was frozen. Shut up, he mouthed silently. Martin turned a single page in the file. My client was forcefully removed from the marital home without resources, he recounted. The plaintiff claimed the home, the vehicles, and Whitmore Capital itself were his sole and independent property. The judge's pen paused mid-air. Martin's gaze lifted, and for the first time, Evelyn looked directly at Grant. Not with anger, but with cold, calculating measurement. However, Martin stated, we have compelling evidence of fraudulent misrepresentation of true ownership. Randall exploded from his seat. Objection. This is a baseless fishing expedition, Your Honor. The judge's eyes narrowed dangerously. Overruled. Proceed. Martin's voice remained utterly calm, unaffected by the rising tension. Your Honor, the initial seed funding for Whitmore Capital was provided by a vehicle named Arbor Creek Holdings. Grant, unable to contain his years of rehearsed mythology, blurted out, Venture Capital. Martin's mouth curved slightly, the controlled smile of a master hunter watching a painstakingly set trap finally snap shut. Yes, Martin agreed smoothly. Arbor Creek. He handed a dense, notarized document to the judge, then slid an identical copy toward Randall Clean. Randall's hands began to shake visibly as he opened the folder. His eyes scanned the page once, then froze, the color completely draining from his face until he was ash-white. Martin spoke without raising his voice. Randall, please read the beneficiary's name aloud for the court record. Randall's throat constricted. He forced the name out like swallowing ground glass. Evelyn Sterling. A sound escaped the courtroom simultaneously. A collective gasp of disbelief, the soft ripple of shock. Margaret Whitmore whispered too loudly, her voice cracking the decorum. Sterling? Like Caleb Sterling? Martin turned toward the gallery, his composure unshakable. Like Caleb Sterling, yes, he confirmed. The industrialist, the financier, the philanthropist. Grant shot up from his seat so violently that his heavy chair scraped loudly across the floor tiles. That's impossible, he snapped, his voice suddenly high-pitched and hysterical. Her last name is Whitmore. She's nobody. She worked at a miserable diner in. Evelyn spoke for the first time since taking her seat. Her voice was pure and quiet, cutting through Grant's panic. My mother's maiden name was Whitmore, she revealed. I used it because I desperately wanted to know if a man could love me entirely without the weight and expectation of my father's name. She looked straight at Grant, utterly cold. I got my answer. The judge studied the documents before him, his demeanor shifting from bored to acutely serious. This states that Arbor Creek provided 88% of the initial funding, he articulated slowly. It was structured as a callable loan, and the beneficiary retains absolute control. Grant's lips parted, unable to form words. Callable. Martin explained gently, speaking to Grant as if addressing a small child who had never bothered to read the rules of the complex game he was playing. It means your company immediately owes the beneficiary $12 million, plus compounded interest. Immediate payment, Mr. Whitmore, or forfeiture of the assets used as collateral. Grant's voice rose to a near shriek. She is lying. The judge slammed his gavel down, the sound deafening. Sit down, counsel. Martin lifted one final page from the file. There is also a significant penalty clause, Martin announced, triggered when the beneficiary is unlawfully displaced from a primary residence funded by the loan. Randall looked dangerously close to collapse. Martin turned to the judge. We move to immediately freeze all assets of Whitmore Capital, pending a complete forensic audit and liquidation to cover the debt. The judge's gaze hardened as he looked at the sweating Grant. You were attempting to sell a company you didn't fully own, the judge stated flatly. Grant's face cycled rapidly from bright red to deathly pale. I own it, he insisted, but his voice was thin and defeated. The judge's gavel came down a second time, final and crushing. Motion granted. Whitmore Capital assets are frozen immediately. Travel restricted. The courtroom exploded into immediate whispers. Phones instantly appeared. A clerk stepped out quickly, too quickly for routine procedure. Margaret clutched her pearls with trembling hands. Harper's eyes darted frantically, already calculating the quickest route of social escape. Grant stood there, suspended, his mind seemingly unable to grasp the magnitude of the words. Evelyn rose slowly to her feet. She offered no smile, no visible gloating. She simply looked at him and delivered the fatal blow. The prenup is ironclad, Grant. You leave with exactly what you came in with. Then she paused, her eyes flicking pointedly down toward the expensive timepiece on his wrist. Actually, she added softly, I paid for that. Grant's hand moved instinctively to cover his watch. For the first time in his life, he looked truly deeply afraid of being publicly seen. Outside the courthouse doors, the world had changed pace faster than Grant's overstressed nervous system could possibly process. The press was not supposed to be present for a routine divorce hearing, but certain names, like Sterling, travel faster than light. A solid wall of cameras met him like sudden, blinding judgment. Mr. Whitmore, is it true you threw Caleb Sterling's daughter out into a blizzard? Is Whitmore Capital completely frozen? Is your Sandstone merger officially dead? Flashbulbs strobed his face into an agonizing blur of raw panic. Margaret raised her designer handbag like a pitiful shield. Animals, she hissed at the reporters. They are absolute animals. Grant shoved his way through the crowd, his heart slamming wildly against his ribs. He reached his massive black Range Rover and fumbled desperately for the keys. He pressed the ignition. The sophisticated dashboard lit up, displaying a single cold message. Remote disable. Contact lender. His breath left his lungs in a painful rush. The luxury vehicle no longer recognized him. The lease was held under the company's assets. The company was now frozen, and so was he. Margaret shrieked, Start it! Start it now, Grant! He pressed the button again, futilely. Nothing. They were forced to hail a yellow taxi, the first moment of genuine, non-cinematic humiliation. It was the quiet horror of realizing that absolute money, when extracted correctly, can vanish without making a single sound. At the Whitmore Capital sleek glass tower, Grant marched into the polished lobby, convinced that the sheer force of his ownership could override the current, messy reality. The security guard, a middle-aged man with a name tag reading James, stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, James said, his voice uncomfortable yet entirely firm. Your access badge has been deactivated. Grant could only stare at him, stunned. Deactivated? James swallowed hard. We received a federal writ, sir. No executive access without a court-appointed monitor present. Employees waiting in the lobby pretended with visible effort not to watch the spectacle, but every single one of them was watching. Grant felt something far worse than shame. He felt the brittle foundation of his entire myth cracking loudly beneath his feet. He spun around sharply. Fine. I'll handle this from home. Home, which now felt like a mausoleum of their former life. When Grant and Margaret arrived back at the sprawling estate, the silence hit them first, a weighty, unnatural absence of activity. The house was too quiet. There was no bustling housekeeper folding linens, no flustered assistant juggling calls, and worst of all, no comforting, buttery scent of lunch being prepared. On the vast, cold expanse of the marble kitchen island, a neatly arranged stack of keys lay beside a crisp, white envelope. Margaret snatched the note, her usually steady hands visibly trembling. Asterisk payroll deposit reversed. We had been instructed to cease work immediately due to the asset freeze. We cleared the remaining perishables as final payment. Rosa. Margaret's eyes stretched wide, reflecting the sterile white kitchen lights. They took the food, she whispered, her voice laced with outrage. As if sustenance was a proprietary privilege the poor were now brazenly stealing. Grant sank onto a high stool, the cold marble transmitting instantly through his tailored trousers. The merger, he muttered, the word tasting like ash. Sandstone won't sign. Not if assets are frozen solid. Margaret's voice sharpened, cutting through the silence. She's bluffing, Grant. Evelyn just wants you back. She's trying to corner you. Grant managed one laugh, a choked, broken sound that died instantly in the vaulted ceiling. She's a sterling, he said, shaking his head. She doesn't want me back. She wants me erased. Professionally and financially. His phone screamed, slicing through the mounting tension. The display read, *Sandstone Dynamics CEO Office. Grant inhaled deeply, forcing a strained, unnatural charm into his throat. Mr. Pierce? He managed, the laugh he attempted failing to reach his eyes, settling somewhere hollow in his chest. I assume you've heard the rumors? Divorce leverage, Grant offered quickly. Nothing but noise. The voice on the line was a glacier of professional indifference. I'm not calling about rumors, Whitmore, Pierce said flatly. I had lunch with Caleb Sterling this morning. Grant's blood chilled, turning viscous in his veins. He showed me ownership documents, Pierce continued, the facts delivered with meticulous cruelty. It seems you didn't write the core algorithm you were attempting to sell us. Grant tried to stammer out a defense, but the word lodged. That's because your wife did. Pierce cut in, emphasizing the word wife. Under her legal name, MIT Mathematics, class of '08. Her digital fingerprints are all over the original repository's commit history. You tried to sell me stolen goods, Grant. A silence stretched, heavy and profound, across the continent. We are suing for bad faith negotiation, industrial espionage, and breach of contract, Pierce said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Do not contact me or anyone at Sandstone again. The line went dead, leaving a high-pitched electronic whine. Grant stared at the instrument in his hand as if the phone itself had committed the ultimate betrayal. Margaret's voice was a tremulous, thin sound. What did he say? What did Pierce say? Grant swallowed hard, the muscles in his neck protesting. She wrote it, he whispered, the realization hitting him like physical trauma. A distant memory surfaced. Evelyn in their cramped first apartment, standing behind him, pointing at lines of code, offering small, precise suggestions. Back then, Grant had laughed, calling her input cute. He hadn't understood that cute was merely competence wearing a strategically convenient mask. Margaret's mouth tightened into a hard, unforgiving line. We need to fix this, Grant. Now, we need cash. We need a new lawyer, a good one. We need... Margaret clutched the heavy, elaborate strands of pearls around her neck. I have jewelry. My mother's pieces. Grant's eyes flickered to the necklace, a knot forming in his stomach. Yes, he managed. The jewelry. An hour later, Margaret Whitmore walked into a discreet jewelry broker's office on 47th Street, radiating the misplaced air of a queen entering a dungeon. The broker, a small, impassive man with diamond eyes, meticulously examined her pieces. The diamond bracelet, the heavy gold watch, the signature pearl necklace. He showed no admiration, only calculation. Finally, he looked up, bored. $400, he stated flatly. For the gold weight and the silver content of the clasps. Margaret gasped, an indignant sound of disbelief. Are you mad? That necklace alone is worth $50,000. It's antique. The broker shrugged, scraping the pearls with a casual, cruel gesture. It's costume, ma'am. Paste. Good fakes, but fakes nonetheless. Margaret turned with agonizing slowness to face Grant. Grant's face went a sickly gray. He had bought them, the impressive, believable fakes, during the lean years, using their cost to maintain the facade of prosperity, promising himself he would replace them with the real stones later. Later never came. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't rage. Instead, she brought her open hand across his face. The sound echoed in the silent, velvet-lined shop, clean and utterly final. "You dragged me into the gutter," she whispered, her eyes burning with cold clarity. They walked out into the biting Manhattan cold with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the hollow shame clinging to their expensive wool coats. And Grant Whitmore, former king of Midtown, stood on a sidewalk as the melted snow soaked into his $1,000 Italian leather shoes, realizing that humiliation wasn't loud. It wasn't a spectacle. It was slow, insidious, and absolute. Desperation makes people try to rewrite reality. Grant's last remaining currency was his voice, his public image. If he couldn't win in court, he could attempt to win in the court of public opinion. Harper, his former assistant and recent lover, gave him the idea just as she was ending their association. They met at a coffee shop in a dismal neighborhood because Grant couldn't afford anywhere else. "You're trending," Harper said, her eyes glued to her phone, utterly detached. "Not in a good way, though. They're calling you the Snow King." Grant instinctively reached for her hand. She pulled back sharply. "But you can flip it," she continued, emotionless. "People love a victim narrative." "I am the victim," Grant insisted, his throat tight with self-pity. "She lied for 10 years, pretended to be poor. That's fraud." Harper shrugged, scrolling past his latest humiliation meme. "Then sell that. Go on TV. Cry. Say she manipulated you. A calculating heiress using you as a pawn to destroy your company from the inside. People hate billionaires, especially female ones. Play the underdog." She finished her expensive latte and left him with the bill. 2 days later, Grant sat in the intensely bright studio of a syndicated daytime talk show called American Truth. The host, a man famous for manufactured empathy, leaned forward, his face etched with performative concern. "So, Mr. Whitmore," the host began, his voice a soothing rumble, "you married a woman you believed was struggling, bootstrapping her way up from nothing. And all the while she was secretly a sterling, spying, collecting information, stealing." Grant stared directly into the main camera, his eyes carefully damp and wide from hours of practice in the mirror. "It broke me," he said, his voice a calculated tremor. "I loved her, truly, deeply. But she was taking notes, feeding proprietary information to her father, and when I confronted her, she used her family's immense resources to systematically destroy me." He added the final, polished lie smoothly. "The Snow story? Fabricated. She took a private car 10 minutes later. She staged the entire incident for PR leverage." The studio audience murmured in sympathetic shock. In an elegant apartment in Brooklyn Heights, Evelyn watched the broadcast without the slightest flicker of emotion disturbing her serene expression. Martin Hale, her counsel, sat beside her, diligently taking notes. "He's good," Martin admitted, setting his pen down. "He's frighteningly convincing. The audience is eating it up." Evelyn set her teacup down slowly, the delicate china meeting the saucer without a sound. "He forgot about the cameras," she said. Martin's eyes lifted instantly. "Cameras?" Evelyn's voice remained unervingly calm. Grant was pathologically obsessed with monitoring the staff. He installed 4K cameras everywhere. Every room, every gate, every hallway. She paused, the weight of the next sentence sinking into the room. "And he made me the system administrator. It was easier for him than managing the passwords himself." Martin's pen froze mid-stroke. Evelyn stood, walked to a sleek laptop, and clicked into a cloud account. A grid of high-resolution footage instantly populated the screen, each feed time-stamped and crystal clear, the audio pristine. Evelyn turned the laptop slightly toward Martin. On the screen, a video segment played. Margaret's voice, sharp and entitled, sliced through the quiet library air. Asterisk. "You were always a lobby, Grant. Get rid of her." Asterisk. Grant's voice followed. Asterisk. "Severance is already being prepared." Asterisk. Then, the exterior camera feed came into view. Evelyn, alone, walking out of the gates and into the deep, swirling snow. The distinct, metallic click of the gates locking. Grant was clearly visible in the library window, holding a crystal glass, watching her go. Martin exhaled, the sound tight and low. "Release it," he ordered, his voice suddenly authoritative. Evelyn's face didn't change. "Not to the court," she said. She looked at the laptop screen. Not with fury, but like she was watching a door close again, this time realizing she held the keys to the entire internet. She finished her task. Within an hour, a new, anonymous account appeared online at real_. She posted a single video with the caption, "The truth about winter." No rant, no explanation, no hashtags. The footage did what no amount of legal filing or explanation ever could. The internet erupted within minutes. The tide of public opinion reversed violently. Hashtag #JusticeForeign and hashtag #LobbyWife exploded, quickly followed by hashtag #SnowKing, which became a viral synonym for narcissistic deceit. Women across the country began sharing their own stories of being used, belittled, and discarded by powerful men in the comment sections, which instantly turned into sprawling confession booths. The American Truth host retracted the segment in a humiliating televised apology. Grant's practiced, sorrowful face became a meme, frozen in a low-resolution screenshot as his elaborate web of lies collapsed around him. Protesters materialized outside Whitmore Capitol, chanting and carrying signs. Sponsors pulled out, demanding immediate severance. Grant watched it all unfold from a cheap, temporary apartment with thin, peeling walls. His phone rang. It was Margaret, sobbing hysterically on the line. "The police are here, Grant," she whispered, her voice ragged. Grant's stomach dropped. "Why? What are they saying?" "They have a warrant," she cried. "They're talking about fraud. Embezzlement. They say I spent company funds. Millions." Grant's knees buckled, and he leaned against the wall for support. The initial asset freeze was no longer the worst thing he faced. Now, his actual freedom was on the table. Evelyn didn't celebrate. She didn't post again. She simply allowed silence to do what silence always does, amplify the shattering truth. The final hearing wasn't in the genteel setting of family court. It was in a large, cold fraud courtroom, heavier air, packed benches, and a sense of official gravity. Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table, impeccable in a severe navy suit, authority stitched into the fabric. Grant and Margaret sat at the defense table next to a public defender who looked defeated before the proceedings even began. Grant's custom suit no longer fit him properly. Perhaps his confidence had simply shrunk inside the expensive wool. Martin Hale stood without any theatrics. He didn't need them. He had binders full of documents. "Your Honor," Martin began, his voice calm and precise. "The forensic audit revealed a systematic diversion of funds. Over a period of 6 years, $3.2 million was transferred to shell companies registered exclusively to Margaret Whitmore." A collective sound, like the courtroom trying to look away but unable, swept across the gallery. Martin continued, unperturbed. "These funds were falsely labeled as consulting fees. They were used to purchase lavish jewelry, exotic vacations, and covered substantial gambling debts." Margaret's face tightened, but she remained silent, unable to deny the meticulously researched facts. Grant stood abruptly, his voice cracking with desperation. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about any of this." Martin merely lifted a large, blown-up image of a canceled check. "You signed," he said quietly, pointing to the distinctive loop of Grant's signature. Grant stared at his own handwriting as if it belonged to a malevolent stranger. The judge leaned forward, his face severe. "Do the defendants have a defense?" The public defender sighed, looking at his notes. "Your Honor," he said wearily, "my clients plead incompetence." The judge's face hardened instantly. "Incompetence is not a defense for systematic wire fraud," he snapped. "Especially not when you were the chief executive officer of a major firm." The judge then turned his attention to Evelyn. "Ms. Sterling," he said, "you hold significant ownership leverage regarding the remaining assets. What is your request?" The room held its collective breath. This was the moment where revenge usually screamed loudest. Evelyn stood slowly and walked toward the center of the courtroom. She looked directly at Grant. He was sweating profusely, and a flicker of weak, pathetic hope rose in his eyes. Evelyn's voice was soft, almost conversational. "I don't want him in prison," she said. Grant's eyes widened, genuine relief fighting to surface. Evelyn continued, the same unshakable calm possessing her. "Prison is too easy. Provides a simple ending to the story. It turns them into martyrs or victims in their own minds." She paused, looking around the hushed courtroom. "I want them to understand, truly understand, what it means to start over." She turned back to the judge. "I am calling in the Arbor Creek loan. Immediate full repayment, exercising the foreclosure clause, taking possession of Whitmore Capital, seizing the estate, and all personal accounts to satisfy the outstanding debt." The judge gave a single, firm nod. "Granted." Margaret made a strangled, terrible sound, a cry of absolute material loss. Evelyn reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single manila envelope. She walked over to the defense table and placed it directly in front of Grant. His hand shook visibly as he touched the paper. "What is this?" he whispered. Confusion etched into his features. "A deed," Evelyn said simply. "To the old hunting cabin in the Adirondacks. The one your father left you. It's in your name and it's been paid off completely." Grant stared, utterly bewildered. "It's run down," Evelyn added, her voice devoid of emotion. "No electricity, wood stove only, but it is a roof." Margaret exploded, rising violently from her chair. "You expect us to live in a shack? In the wilderness?" Evelyn looked at her, her expression unchanged. "You didn't mind throwing me out into a blizzard, Margaret?" she said quietly. "This, I assure you, is mercy." Grant's tears spilled over, genuine anguish finally breaking through his practiced facade. "Evelyn," he whispered brokenly, reaching a shaking hand toward her. "Please." Evelyn leaned slightly closer, her final words reserved just for him. "And I'm keeping the dog," she said. A ripple of sharp, relieved, involuntary laughter moved through the courtroom, breaking the tension like glass. Grant flinched, the sound hitting him like a second slap. The judge banged his gavel heavily. Judgment entered. Assets transferred. Case closed. Security escorted Grant and Margaret out. Not violently but firmly. Phones were collected. Expensive watches surrendered. Keys handed over. Evelyn did not watch them leave. That, she knew, was the deepest part of their punishment. Not being worthy of her attention. Outside, the snow had stopped. Sunlight hit the wet pavement, illuminating the ordinary chaos of the city. Evelyn walked out with Martin Hale by her side. A call came through on Martin's secure line. "It's Sandstone," Martin said, listening intently. "Pierce wants to renegotiate with the new owner. He's offering 20% higher than Grant's last proposal." Evelyn's lips curved into a slow, genuine smile. The first real smile in months. "Tell him," she said, her voice resonant with new power, "to meet me at the Maple Street Diner." Martin raised a skeptical eyebrow. "The diner where you used to work, Miss Sterling?" Evelyn nodded once. "Yes," she confirmed. "I want to remember where I came from. And," she added softer, speaking more to herself than to Martin, "I want him to remember that the person serving coffee might own the building one day." Years later, Grant stood in a glittering gala kitchen, wearing a crisp catering uniform, pouring expensive white wine for guests who had long since forgotten he ever existed. He didn't dare look up until he heard her voice directly beside him. "Thank you," Evelyn said calmly. He froze, the bottle tilted precariously in his hand. He had anticipated revenge, a scornful word, a moment of gloating triumph. Evelyn gave him none of those things. She gave him something far colder, recognition without emotion. "I used to know him," she told her fiancé at the table, her tone distant, merely stating a clinical fact. There was no hate, no anger, only a detached sense of pity. Grant walked into the dark alley and sat on an overturned crate as the snow began to fall again. Big, wet, lonely flakes. Just like the day he had locked the gate. This time he was utterly, completely alone in the cold. Inside the ballroom, Evelyn laughed softly, accepting her fiancé's hand and stepping onto the dance floor, finally, unequivocally free. And the lesson landed quietly, the way the best lessons do. The man who confuses kindness with weakness will inevitably learn the precise, crushing temperature of a locked gate.